real interesting story from The Atlantic, how COVID pushed a generation of young people to the right. Lots of stuff in this.
Yeah.
One thing that I seized on, I wanted to talk a little bit about, Cecil, that I hadn't really thought about. But during the pandemic, more and more people began to socialize, of course, online. So they can socialize on social media. And one of the things I hadn't really considered is that on social media, those are really gender-separated spaces.
I didn't realize that either. When I heard this, I was like, you know what? They kind of are in a lot of ways.
Really
There's
are.
a lot of gendered spaces online. And those gendered spaces isolated men and women.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you have you have now a far right-leaning young male base that feels in many ways pushed in that position because of COVID and other things, and unhappy because of it. And then they want change, and the change they see is the change on the right.
Yeah, it really began, well, it didn't begin, but it worked to deepen the radicalization of young men against feminism.
Yeah.
There's a lot of men who've been erroneously taught that feminism is not compatible with their own sense of self and masculinity.
Yeah.
They've been taught that feminism, again, erroneously, is means like the supremacy of women over men. They've been taught a lot of bad shit about feminism. So because they've gotten their ideas from a bunch of people who have weaponized those ideas in order to sell shit and radicalize those people, and then to sell them more shit.
Yeah.
And it's really been a tragic reworking of American culture as a result. And now Trump in the last election, Trump basically erased all of the gulf between Democrats and Republicans that young people had always expressed. So young voters had always expressed a huge leaning toward the left. And after the pandemic, a lot of that's been erased.
Yeah, it's been gutted. And I think they, these male influencers did a thing which a lot of people do, which is create an enemy.
Yeah.
And then point their group at them and say that enemy is coming for you, and that enemy is trying to suppress you, that enemy is trying to oppress you. And, you're safe with me and I'm going to help you fight them. And they chose feminism as that thing. When, it's so funny because you think any guy who's secure in their own masculinity isn't threatened by feminism.
Right.
Any person who's really secure in their own masculinity should be, there's nothing there that's threatening. The only thing that's there is there's a chance to learn from someone else. That's really it. Because that old saying that if you're privileged, any kind of equality feels like oppression is exactly this. And that's what they seized on. They made all those young men think this equality that you're feeling now, any bit of it, and it wasn't even like a true equality, but anytime there was any kind of sense that there was an equality, they made sure to point to it as oppression. And people believed them. They believed them. And they played on that feeling that all these young men were having from this place of privilege that they had before. And it created a whole group of people that are probably going to vote right for a long time.
Yeah.
They suspect they're not going to be somebody who's going to snap back.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things that they point out, and I think rightfully so, is that people in their teens and 20s begin to solidify a lot of their views that they'll then hold for the rest of their lives. One of the things we were talking about on the Dad Show the other day, and it's something I think is appropriate here, and it's something that's on my mind a lot, is I do think that we hit a moment socially where I think Me Too really helped to kind of drive some of this, where we began to have really important conversations about about violence against women, about the predatory nature of certain power dynamics, about, really important elements of how the patriarchy affects all of us. And I think one of the things that got lost in there, and I don't know how to fix it, but I just think about it a lot, is that I think that we've kind of built a narrative that a lot of men are really upset about, where the view of masculinity revolves around who not to be.
Yeah.
And there's not a whole lot of messaging about who to be.
Yeah.
And that's not an effective message. That's a bad message because it's ineffective. it's not a bad message because those are unimportant conversations. Ironically, those are deeply important, like life-savingly important conversations to have. But those are also messages that, like, if all the messages for that young men hear in their minds, at least, if all that they're sort of taking in their minds and absorbing is don't be this, don't do that. And then we don't have any good messaging from our side that says, be this, do that. It leaves a vacuum. And we always, I think, good intentionally, like thought, well, like, that's because we want people to invent their own masculinity. We don't want it to be constrained by these sort of like, traditional social forces. The problem is that the right saw that as an opportunity to fill it with the Tates and to fill it with like the Jordan Petersons and to fill it with, when you leave a vacuum, you leave a big hole for grifters. You leave a big hole, especially in young minds. And I think like it's a real problem in our messaging around masculinity and femininity that we've said that we've framed the conversation about masculinity in terms of who not to be rather than positive messages about who to be. And I don't know what the solution is. It just feels urgent to me.
I'm drawing a connection in my head. Maybe there's not a connection, but I'm drawing a connection in my head about women in, say, the 50s through to like, the 90s. It was probably maybe to the 80s. I'm not sure. Women could probably tell me better. But there was this idea that like, if you're a woman, there's a career for you in teaching. There's a career for you in nursing. There's a career for you in daycare. But that's kind of it.
Right.
There's really not a lot of other places that you can go. And so they didn't have representation in their head about how they could be something else, right? We came very close to having twice, I think, a woman being president, right? The highest thing in the land for you to look at and say, oh, okay, one day I might be president or whatever. Definitely we had a vice president, right? One day I might be vice president. And women fill all kinds of roles today that they traditionally, if you look back in time, did not have any opportunity to do. And I wonder too, like, it's just seeing guys being able to cope and do the right things like you're suggesting that could help fill those gaps. Because all you have to do is just get out there and make sure that there's enough dudes doing this stuff to say, it's okay, guys, we're not threatened by this sort of, by feminism. Feminism doesn't threaten us. It's okay. We can live in the same world where that exists, and we can all thrive together, and we can understand each other at a level we never understood each other before.
Right.
If there's somebody out there modeling that behavior, that's a good thing. But instead what you're seeing, like you suggest, is like, Adrian, Andrew, what is Peters? What is that guy's name? No, it's Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson and Andrew Tate, and to a lesser extent, Joe Rogan. Like I'm listening to Joe Rogan now, and Joe Rogan's, Joe Rogan does have a lot of things that you should do, right? It's like talking about how you should be doing hard things, like how you should, like workouts should be hard. You should be reliant on yourself. Like those are messages that are like, they're not completely obvious, but they're undertones of his show. And I think those guys all seized on that sort of thing. We talked about loneliness this last time, but also solitude. And in a lot of ways, Joe Rogan is singing the same things on his show every week. So yeah, I think that there just needs to be somebody who's just able to show that. And I think there have been. I don't think that it's bereft. I think there are people who are doing it. But I just think that for some reason, I think what sells better isn't, this is, what are you worried about? Instead, it's, you should be worried, sells way better.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the part of the problem is the narrative of you are a victim and here is the aggressor. Everybody takes to that message and like saying like, hey, here are some heroes you can have that exude a kind of masculinity that is not threatened by femininity. There's no easy binary aggressor victim. Like it doesn't work in the same ways.
Right.
It's just harder to spin for people. So the messaging has been neater and slicker and easier. The answers have been more ready and available on the other end. It's a more complicated answer on our side.
And think about how they treat women, even when they're talking about how they want to be with women.
Yeah.
They treat them adversarially. right? Like think about how they treat that. Like if they're talking about like that pickup sort of idea, you know, that more plates and dates or whatever stuff, you know, like that stuff is all about women are an adversary that you need to conquer. That's not about like find somebody that is compatible with you and like learn to live with that person and love that person and enjoy life with that's not there at all. That's not part of it at all. It's all about being adversarial. And they sold all that stuff.
Yeah, it's the adversarial mentality, and it's also the acquisitional mentality.
Yeah, conquering. Yeah. All right, well, that's going to wrap it up for this week. We're going to have a patron show for you on Thursday, so you patrons can join in and hang out with us. But for the rest of you, we're going to leave you like we always do with the Skeptic's Creed and see you on Monday.
Credulity is not a virtue. It's fortune cookie cutter, mommy issue, hypno-Babylon bullshit. Couched in scientician, double bubble, toil and trouble, pseudo quasi alternative, acupunctuating, pressurized, stereogram, pyramidal, free energy healing, watered downward spiral, brain deadpan sales pitch, late night info docutainment. Leo, Pisces, cancer cures, detox, reflex, foot massage, death in towers, tarot cards, psychic healing, crystal balls, Bigfoot, Yeti, aliens, churches, mosques and synagogues, temples, dragons, giant worms, Atlantis, dolphins, truthers, birthers, witches, wizards,